her fish. It was a hunch that took her out on the fishing boat that day. She often had hunches, sometimes during a colorful dream or when a bird crossed her path. It was a gift that no one knew about, and she didn't share either. The humiliation at being laughed at by a skeptical world would be too great. Instead, she kept her visions, musings, and images close, bragging only to her diary when they later made a kind of sense. She was not a diver, not even a very good swimmer, but she felt strongly that the little touristy fishing trip would bear fruit. So, along with a small group of 20 strangers, she boarded the small boat. There, they were each handed a pre-baited rod and a quick lesson on how to pull up a catch. For the most part, she was left alone. It was an inexpensive charter for people who had just wanted to get away from the bars and cafes of the island and be able to write home later that they had done something different. The small boat was just big enough to give her privacy, the kind she needed when she meditated, and that's what she did before sending her line out to the sea. Around her, husbands and wives and husbands and girlfriends were snuggling, using the rod as an excuse to bond and breathe into each other. Maybe it was cheaper if two people sailed and used only one rod. It didn't matter. A cynical thought that she quickly brushed away. She was happy to be alone, although each wave reminded her that she wasn't alone, but tied to the wider, blue world. At least she told herself that. An hour passed, and many of the other tourists, bored and hot, had deserted their rods for beers and snacks at the stern. They were having fun and paid no mind to a young woman muttering incantations underneath her sun hat. The sounds, even her humming, was foreign to her, let alone the strange words that fell from her mouth. As each letter escaped her lips, the wind passed by and picked them up, sending them flying across the sea. The sun was bright, and she wished she had brought a hat with a larger brim. She often worried about sunspots, not wanting to look like some of her aged relatives who chose golf over sun protection. That included her father, who resembled slightly a giant turtle when he aged, with all his tawny facial spots. Actually, she wasn't sure turtles had spots, but she liked the image of her father being a wise old tortoise, and that memory gave her heart a tug. On the second tug, she realized it wasn't her heart, but her line. This was her first time really fishing. As a kid, she had fished for prizes at the local fun fair, winning a plastic charm and some sweets. Now, here on the water, she was following her heart line, and it was tugging. With the steadiness she had learned as a Sunday painter, she held gently but firm and became as one with the rod as she did with the brush. If it's to come, it will, she said to herself, and then started muttering again in the strange language. One of the crew noticed the activity and came to her, offering helpful hints on bringing it in. He seemed surprised. Apparently no one ever caught anything on the boat. Just as she had thought, the whole idea was a boat ride for lovers who, like the fish, did not want to get caught. The sailor, however, was pleased at her conviction and encouraged her movements without interfering with her dance. It took a few minutes of struggling with the line. For a moment, she thought she was losing her grip, but suddenly a large, spiny fish appeared. A recent vegan, she had to convince herself that he looked happy as she reeled him onto the deck. The sailor congratulated her, unhooked the chubby silver fish, and put it into a souvenir bucket for her to take home. "First bucket this season," he said, winking at her. He suggested a cafe that would cook it for her, fresher than anything she might ever eat in her life. When the boat pulled into the harbor, she carried her bucket and walked up the hill, but didn't go to the cafe. That's not what her dream had suggested. Instead, she went back to her little hotel room and filled up the bathtub with water. The fish, of course, had mercifully expired in the bucket, but she wanted to give him a watery send-off, and it was too large for the sink. She picked up a plastic knife from a takeout meal. It was lightweight, but strong enough to break open the skin. As she cut into the fish, the same words she had sung on the boat came back to her. The light in the room started to change as she sang them. From the late-day shadows, the walls began to glow with a soft gold, the kind of gold you might see on the walls of buildings in the Mid-East, like the one she once saw in a book in a town called Isfahan. She felt her heart speed up as she cut. It was always like this when her messages came. From out of the fish's bloated belly, a small jar floated into the bathwater. It was made of rough clay, unbroken, and strangely beautiful, with the curved shape of a woman with handles that looked like arms. The middle was very wide, reminding her of the Venus of Willendorf with her deep, fecund belly. She was moved. How many worlds it must have passed through to arrive intact in her bathtub this night. Leaving the fish behind, she gently picked up the jar and put it down on a soft towel on her bed. It had a tiny top made of hardened soil and stone, but when she touched it, it crumbled like the cork on an ancient bottle of wine from Napoleon's cellar. She picked up the pieces, wrapped them safely into a scarf, then lightly tapped the bottom of the jar. She was as nervous as if she was watching a chrysalis transform, frightened it would fly away before she had a chance to greet it. But it didn't fly. Instead, a small bit of ragish material, folded like a tube, came out through the opening. It was crusty, but dropped out easily, and was followed by another smaller piece. Small as it was, she could make out markings drawn with some sort of black ink. It could only have been in a language from another tongue. There was an image, too, something roundish with 3 points. She thought it looked like a crown. As for the tube of rags, she left it alone, as it was too fragile to inspect. Others could take on that responsibility later on. While searching for more in the jar, her fingertips were struck by the etched shapes of the clay. There were no more materials inside, so she allowed her fingers to explore the walls of the empty jar, tracing up and down and left and right. The clay was so deeply carved that she began to recognize the shape of the etchings. She felt stars. Many, many stars of different sizes. A star is one of the first things you learn to draw as a child, and she enjoyed the feeling of following the lines as if she were etching them herself. For fun, she took out her cell phone and pointed it into the dark shadows of the jar. And there they were, an entire galaxy of stars, carved in by an ancient potter from across the sea of time. Back in London, she stood on Primrose Hill and gazed into the clear, cool night. Some say that meaning is what you put on something. Some say it all means nothing. For her, there was meaning in everything. That's what kept her going. If she believed, that was enough. Once upon a time, there was a queen more beloved than others. But the queen, though loved, also had worries. One night, after sending her handmaidens home, she went to the balcony and quietly told her story to the listening stars. They seemed to twinkle in response to her words. Tired, then, she slipped into her bed and dreamt that someday, someone, somewhere, might hear her tale when the time was right and the dreamer was ready. Epilogue. In 1947, a discovery was made in the desert. Ancient manuscripts were found in a cave at a site called Qumran. The parchments were in jars and contained many of the biblical stories of which the world is familiar. One story was not found in any of the jars. The story that seemed to appear is that of a heroic woman, a queen in Persia. A festival was created to honor her courage. Even now, the story of Istar is still missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There is no record of it in the shrine of the book, but in the sea, many of our secrets are held, and in time, they will find their way home.